It is 0300 hours on February 28, 1942. The Channel Islands are still and frozen beneath a moonless sky. A German sentry stands at his post near a military installation on the occupied island of Guernsey, stamping his feet against the cold, breath misting in the darkness. He has been there for 2 hours and will stand for 2 more. He is warm in his gray-green uniform, confident in the garrison that surrounds him, certain that the enemy is distant and powerless. Within the next 3 minutes he will be dead. He will not fire his weapon. He will not cry out. No alarm will sound. By morning, he will simply be reported missing, and the Germans occupying the island will never discover precisely how he died or by whose hand. This is the story of one of the Second World War's most extraordinary and carefully guarded secrets, the systematic training of British commandos in the lethal art of silent killing. It is a narrative that exists in the margins of military history, discussed in whispered terms by those who survived it, and deliberately obscured by decades of official secrecy. What emerges from the declassified records, the personal testimonies, and the technical documentation is not a tale of Hollywood fiction, but something far more unsettling, a methodical, almost clinical approach to the elimination of enemy personnel without detection. This was not war in the traditional sense. This was assassination dressed in the language of military necessity, and it would become one of the most closely held and vigorously denied aspects of British wartime operations. The implications of what was taught, how it was taught, and by whom it was taught ripple through the moral landscape of the 20th century. It forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about what civilized nations will do when survival feels uncertain, and what happens when you train men to kill in ways that leave no witnesses and no evidence. The story of these techniques, the remarkable individuals who developed them, and the operations in which they were deployed reveals something profound about the nature of clandestine warfare and the fine line between military necessity and calculated murder. By 1940, Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. France had fallen in the summer, the armies of Europe had been swept aside, and the British Expeditionary Force had barely escaped annihilation at Dunkirk. The island nation, denuded of its continental allies, faced an enemy that controlled the entire western seaboard of Europe, from Norway to the Spanish frontier. Invasion appeared not merely possible, but imminent. The German army, the Wehrmacht, had conquered Poland, Belgium, the Netherlands, and France in campaigns that had lasted weeks rather than months. British military doctrine, built upon the assumption of a prolonged war of attrition in which superior industrial capacity would eventually prevail, lay in tatters. The strategic situation was desperate, but it was not entirely hopeless. Britain retained command of the seas around its home islands and possessed the ability to project power across the Channel through small-scale operations. The German occupation of Europe, however complete it appeared, could not be total. Resistance movements were beginning to form in the conquered territories. Supply lines stretched from Germany across thousands of miles of hostile or potentially hostile terrain. Garrisons and administrative centers, airfields and munitions factories existed in an occupied landscape where the local population harbored resentment, if not yet active hostility, towards their occupiers. What Britain needed was a way to exploit these vulnerabilities. Conventional military operations were impossible. The British Army was too small and too weakly equipped to attempt a second front against the Wehrmacht. What was required was something different. A form of warfare that could be waged on the enemy's terms, by small groups of men operating behind enemy lines, striking at targets of strategic value whilst remaining hidden, organized, and supplied. This was the genesis of the Special Operations Executive, formally established in July 1940 under the direction of Hugh Dalton, Minister of Economic Warfare, with the explicit instruction to set Europe ablaze. Yet there was a profound problem inherent in this strategy. Special operations forces, saboteurs, intelligence agents, liaison officers with resistance groups, required more than courage and determination. They required skills that conventional military training did not provide. A soldier trained in trench warfare or platoon tactics would be useless in occupied France, working with a small cell of resistance fighters, isolated from support, hunted by the Gestapo and the Wehrmacht's security apparatus. These men needed to be able to move through occupied territory undetected. They needed to be able to gather intelligence, recruit and motivate resistance fighters, coordinate sabotage operations, and evade capture. And, in the event of discovery, they needed to be able to defend themselves and eliminate threats without alerting other enemy forces in the vicinity. The existing methods of military training were manifestly inadequate. A man trained only in conventional infantryman's skills was as likely to reveal his position as to conceal it. There were no established doctrines for close-quarters combat that emphasized silence and speed over power. There were no systematic approaches to the elimination of sentries without raising an alarm. There were no schools teaching the subtle arts of killing in the darkness, of moving through shadows, of leaving no trace. This gap in military capability would prove to be one of the most urgent challenges facing Britain's emerging Special Operations Forces. The solution came from an unexpected quarter. William Ewart Fairbairn was a Scottish police officer who had spent much of his career in Shanghai, where he had served in the Shanghai Municipal Police during the turbulent 1920s and 1930s. Shanghai was a place of extraordinary violence, dominated by criminal syndicates, riven by political factions, and subject to periodic warfare between Chinese military forces and the Japanese army. Fairbairn, frustrated by the inadequacy of conventional police training methods in such an environment, had undertaken extensive study of Asian fighting systems, particularly Chinese close-quarters combat techniques. He had developed a systematic method of hand-to-hand fighting that emphasized speed, aggression, and the targeting of vulnerable areas of the human body. Fairbairn's approach was fundamentally different from the traditions of Western boxing or wrestling that dominated military training at the time. Where Western combat sports emphasized strength, technique, and sporting convention, Fairbairn's method treated fighting as a lethal encounter in which the objective was to incapacitate or eliminate an opponent in the shortest possible time frame, using whatever methods proved most effective. This was fighting stripped of pretense, divorced from sporting convention, reimagined as a practical problem in the application of violence. Working with Eric Sykes, a former soldier with experience in hand-to-hand fighting, Fairbairn developed a comprehensive system of unarmed combat that was specifically designed for commandos and special operations personnel. The system, which came to be taught at specialist training facilities across Britain, was built around several key principles. First, movements should be economical and efficient. Every action should serve a specific purpose and waste no motion. Second, attacks should target areas of maximum vulnerability: the eyes, the throat, the groin, the knees, the insteps. Third, the objective should be to incapacitate an opponent as rapidly as possible, allowing the operative to either flee or deal with additional threats. The entire methodology was oriented towards what might be termed asymmetrical violence, using technique and knowledge of anatomy to defeat opponents who might be larger, stronger, or better armed. The physical techniques taught in these courses were systematic and progressively more sophisticated. Students learned strikes to vulnerable areas, the edge-of-hand blow to the neck that could sever nerves and blood vessels, the upward strike beneath the jaw that could break the neck, the eye rake and gouge designed to temporarily incapacitate through pain and loss of vision. They learned throws and joint locks that could either incapacitate an opponent or create the opening for a killing blow. They learned techniques specifically designed for eliminating sentries: the approach from behind, using the darkness and terrain for concealment, the sudden application of pressure to render the victim unconscious without allowing him to cry out, the swift follow-up designed to ensure permanent incapacitation. But the techniques were only part of the picture. Equally important was the psychological component, the mental conditioning that would allow a man to move through darkness, locate an enemy sentry without being detected, and execute him before he could raise an alarm. This required a particular type of mental discipline. The operative needed to understand terrain and light in ways that conventional military training did not address. He needed to move silently, which meant understanding the physics of footfall, the distribution of weight, the negotiation of obstacles in darkness. He needed to understand the habits and vulnerabilities of sentries, the fatigue that set in during night watches, the tendency to focus outward rather than inward, the psychological vulnerability that accompanied isolation and cold. The most famous innovation to emerge from this program was the Fairbairn-Sykes fighting knife, a double-edged blade roughly 18 centimeters, 7 inches in length, with a grip designed for rapid deployment and use in confined spaces. The knife was not, as is sometimes suggested, designed primarily for hand-to-hand combat. Rather, it was designed as a tool for silent elimination at close quarters, for use against unsuspecting or trapped opponents. The double-edged design allowed penetration at virtually any angle. The shape of the handle was refined through experimentation to provide optimal grip and control for the specific techniques that had been developed. The knife became almost iconic in its association with commando operations, but it was merely one tool in a comprehensive system. The training itself was conducted at a variety of specialist facilities across Britain, most notably at Oshawa Training Camp near Arisaig in the Scottish Highlands. The locations were chosen for their isolation, their terrain, and their distance from population centers. Men were put through intensive courses that combined physical conditioning, technical instruction in fighting and close-quarters combat, firearms training adapted for silent or suppressed fire, and practical exercises in moving through terrain undetected. The training was deliberately harsh. Students were subjected to scenarios designed to replicate the stress and fear they would encounter in actual operations. Mock sentries were stationed and the trainees tasked with approaching undetected and neutralizing them. Standards were rigorous. Men who failed to meet them were returned to regular units. The training documents that survive, heavily redacted and still somewhat difficult to access, suggest a level of systematic development that rivals any modern military program. Techniques were refined through observation and practice. Success and failure were analyzed. Methods that proved ineffective were abandoned. Approaches that proved successful were standardized and codified. The entire endeavor was characterized by a ruthless pragmatism. What mattered was not tradition or convention or sportsmanship, but effectiveness. A technique was valuable if it worked in the darkness, in poor conditions, against an alerted or unalerted opponent, and if it allowed the operative to survive and continue his mission. The techniques and training that emerged from this program were deployed across the European theater. Special Operations Executive Agents, inserted into occupied France, relied upon these skills to remain alive. Commandos conducted raids against German installations across the Channel, from the Dieppe raid in August 1942 onwards. Intelligence operations behind enemy lines frequently relied upon operatives trained in these methods. The most secret and most closely controlled deployments were those involving targeted elimination of enemy personnel. The Channel Islands, occupied by German forces since June 1940, became a testing ground for these techniques. A series of small-scale raids were conducted against German positions on Guernsey and Jersey. The most famous, or perhaps infamous, was Operation Condor in December 1942, in which a small group of commandos was landed to eliminate German officers and administration personnel. The operation succeeded in killing several German officials, though at the cost of one commando who was captured and subsequently executed. The precise details of how the German personnel were eliminated remain classified, but contemporary accounts suggest that at least some were killed by close-quarters combat techniques. Resistance operations across occupied Europe occasionally relied upon these methods. SOE agents worked with local resistance groups to identify and eliminate German security personnel, collaborators, and informers. The techniques taught at Oshawa and similar facilities proved invaluable in operations where the objective was to eliminate targets without raising an alarm that might compromise the broader resistance network or lead to reprisals against the civilian population. What is striking about the historical record is how much remains obscure or actively concealed. Many operations involving these techniques have never been fully documented. Casualty figures are estimates at best, often deliberately conflated with conventional combat losses. The psychological impact on German forces is difficult to quantify. Did the fear of sudden, silent elimination at the hands of specially trained commandos affect morale or security precautions? Did it create a sense of vulnerability amongst occupation personnel? The surviving account suggests that it did, but proving this is nearly impossible. German records speak of missing sentries, of unexplained deaths, but rarely provide details of how the victims died or what they faced in their final moments. What we know with certainty is that these operations occurred, that men were trained in these techniques, and that these techniques were employed against German personnel. What remains in shadow is the precise frequency of their use, the exact number of casualties they inflicted, and the extent to which they influenced the broader strategic situation. If you find yourself drawn into these hidden corners of military history, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The stories of how nations prepared for total war, the innovations they developed, the methods they employed, these are the subjects that define our modern world. The British were not alone in developing sophisticated methods of close-quarters combat and silent elimination. The German Army, particularly its commando units and security organizations, developed parallel training programs. The Brandenburgers, the German Special Operations Unit, received training in hand-to-hand combat and close-quarters killing techniques. The Abwehr, German military intelligence, trained operatives in skills very similar to those being taught by the British. The German approach tended to emphasize traditional wrestling and boxing, combined with practical weapon use rather than the systematic targeting of vulnerable anatomical points that characterized the British system, though this distinction should not be overstated. The United States, entering the war in December 1941, eventually developed its own commando training programs, though these largely postdated the British innovations. American Special Operations personnel were sometimes trained by British instructors. The techniques developed by Fairbairn and Sykes influenced American doctrines, though the Americans tended to adapt them rather than adopt them wholesale. American Special Operations training emphasized firearms work and conventional tactical skills alongside close-quarters combat, rather than prioritizing silent elimination as the British program did. What distinguished the British approach was its systematic, almost scientific character. The British had invested considerable intellectual effort in understanding the mechanics of silent killing, in analyzing what worked and what did not, in refining techniques through repeated practice and evaluation. This was not amateur hour or improvisation. This was the application of professional expertise to the problem of eliminating sentries without raising an alarm. Fairbairn and Sykes, drawing on years of experience in high-violence environments, had created a comprehensive system that was then disseminated throughout the British Special Operations community. The German equivalents, whilst competent, did not achieve the same level of systematization. German training in close-quarters combat was more traditional, more rooted in established wrestling and boxing traditions. The psychological emphasis was somewhat different. Germans tended to emphasize aggression and warrior spirit, whilst the British system emphasized technique and economy of motion. Neither system was objectively superior, both could kill effectively. But the British system was arguably better suited to the specific demands of special operations. Moving unseen, approaching sentries in darkness and eliminating them without raising an alarm. The techniques also differed in their assumption about the operational environment. German special operations training was often conducted with the assumption of armed opponents and conventional tactical scenarios. British training, particularly as refined for SOE operations, was more focused on scenarios in which the operative faced unarmed or partially armed targets, where concealment and surprise were paramount, and where making sound or raising an alarm would result in immediate discovery and probable death. Assessing the historical impact of these techniques is profoundly difficult. They were not deployed on a scale that would significantly affect casualty figures or strategic outcomes. The total number of enemy personnel eliminated through these methods was almost certainly in the low hundreds rather than thousands. From a purely statistical perspective, they were marginal. A single air raid on a German city killed more people than these techniques eliminated across the entire war. Yet the psychological and operational impact may have been considerably greater. The fear of sudden silent elimination at the hands of specially trained commandos operating in occupied territory may have influenced German security measures and military deployments. It may have affected the willingness of occupation personnel to operate in isolated positions. It may have contributed to the broader sense of vulnerability that the Germans increasingly felt as the war progressed and the military balance shifted against them. Precise measurement is impossible, but the impact was almost certainly real. The techniques also influenced the development of military special operations doctrine in the post-war period. The SAS, formally established in 1941 but reorganized after the war, inherited much of this training philosophy. Close-quarters combat training, based on principles originally developed by Fairbairn and Sykes, became a standard component of special operations preparation. The Fairbairn-Sykes knife, though no longer in widespread use, remained iconic within Commando and Special Forces cultures. The underlying methodology, training in anatomically targeted violence, in silent movement, in rapid incapacitation, continued to influence special operations training into the Cold War era and beyond. Today, the techniques have largely been superseded by modern approaches that incorporate firearms, tactical training, and combined arms operations. Yet the underlying principles remain. Special operations personnel are trained to move without detection, to understand how to approach and eliminate targets, and to do so in ways that allow them to continue their mission. The specific methods may have changed, but the philosophy endures. The legacy of Fairbairn and Sykes persists in every special operations training program that emphasizes economy of motion, targeting of vulnerable areas, and the psychological preparation necessary to function in environments of extreme violence and danger. Surviving examples of the Fairbairn-Sykes knife can be seen in military museums across Britain, including the Imperial War Museum in London and specialist regimental museums associated with commando units. Training manuals, heavily redacted, have been declassified in recent years, allowing historians to understand the sophistication of the programs that were developed. Personal testimonies from men who underwent this training, many now deceased, have been recorded and archived. Collectively, these sources allow us to reconstruct something of what occurred in the shadow world of British special operations training during the Second World War. We return to that frozen night on Guernsey in February 1942, to the German sentry standing alone in the darkness, unaware that his final moments were approaching. A figure emerges from the shadows, a British commando, trained in techniques that had been refined through countless hours of instruction and practice, moving with the precision and silence that only such training could instill. The sentry never sees his attacker. He may have heard nothing, only the sudden catastrophic failure of his body as hands trained in the anatomy of death found their target. Within seconds, it was finished. By morning, he was simply reported missing. This was the art of silent killing as practiced by Britain during the Second World War, a system of extraordinary sophistication, deployed with precision, held in deliberate obscurity. The men who were trained in these techniques were not assassins in the conventional sense. They were soldiers operating in an unconventional war, in occupied territory against an enemy that had conquered Europe. The techniques they learned were, in the context of their missions, necessary and justified. Yet the story carries a darker undercurrent, one that cannot be ignored. What you train people to do, how you train them to kill, what you teach them about the application of violence, these are not neutral acts. They create capabilities that persist beyond their original purpose. They establish precedents and traditions that influence how future wars are fought. They change the people who receive the training in ways that are not always visible or measurable. The system developed by Fairbairn and Sykes was created for a specific purpose in a specific historical moment, but its implications ripple through the decades that followed. The British Special Operations Forces of the Second World War represented something new in modern warfare, a systematic approach to the elimination of enemy personnel in ways that left no witnesses and no alarms. It was effective, it was ruthless, and it was successful. The techniques they developed, the training they received, and the operations they conducted remain remarkable testament to what can be accomplished when necessity collides with ingenuity and moral constraint is set aside. They made German sentries vanish in the darkness, leaving only absence and mystery in their wake. And in doing so, they changed the nature of warfare itself, not through grand tactics or overwhelming force, but through the quiet, careful application of knowledge, training, and the terrible capabilities of the human body when its vulnerabilities are thoroughly understood.